Phyllis Schlafly has become the person around whom the anti-ERA effort seems to have swirled, and you have certainly become a first-class celebrity. You're on the front page everywhere. People quote you. I don't know whether you've woven yourself into the American comics monologue, which seems to be the ultimate in success or achievement in our country. But I guess you have to be pleased with the results of your work. 3 states remain to ratify ERA, including Illinois, and there's just a little over a year in which that has to be done in order for it to become an amendment to the Constitution. And are you optimistic about its failure?
Yes, I'm very optimistic. We've been winning. I think the American women recognize that the Equal Rights Amendment won't do anything for them. It's just a big fraud. And we've had tremendous successes.
Who's responsible for this fraud? And by fraud, you mean a lie?
Yes.
Who's telling the lie?
Well, when they say ERA means equal pay for equal work, that is the biggest myth of ERA because it has nothing to do with that. What the Equal Rights Amendment...
If it denies discrimination on the basis of sex, then certainly it would deny unequal pay to equal work if the persons performing it were of different sex.
But that's already the law of the land in the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972. And there's no way that the Equal Rights Amendment adds anything to that.
Well, let's give you the benefit of the doubt on this one. I think what your argument there is that it's not needed in this area.
That's right.
All right, so
it's
what?
not needed. Well, it doesn't do anything good. It doesn't
well, it
give
certainly
women...
doesn't hurt to have that in the Constitution, though.
Oh,
if
yes,
you're
it
trying to get
does,
equal
because
pay.
if you put it in the Constitution, then it does all the other things that we don't want done, such as what ERA would do is to make all of our laws sex neutral. You would have to take out words like man and woman, husband and wife, and replace them with person and spouse. Now, your typical example of the law that would be changed would be the Draft Act, which said male citizens of age 18 must register. So the next time we have a war, that must say persons of age 18 must register. And you
Why
know
does that bother you?
Well, it certainly isn't any improvement for women. You got to be kidding to say this is an advance for women, to say, oh, great, the next war...
But women serve in the military now.
But they don't serve equally. And you notice that just a few weeks ago, the Pentagon came in and asked for the repeal of the laws which exempt women from combat duty. Now, there were a lot of people on earlier shows who thought that we were just seeing things under the bed when we said that ERA will put women in combat duty. But now you see the Pentagon has already asked for it. And now we can make that decision on the basis of whether the American people want this or not in the debating and voting on that law. But if you have it in ERA, you don't have any choice. The Constitution will compel it.
But it suggested that common sense will determine what kind of roles women or men play in any arena, including the military.
Oh, no. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And if there's anything that's positively sure, it's that the military will obey the Constitution. Anyway, they've already asked for it. They've already asked to repeal the laws that exempt women from combat duty.
Okay. Do you believe in equality in general for all people? I mean, I have a 3-year-old son, and when he turns 18, I'm not going to be too excited if, God forbid, he has to go to war, any more than I would if I had a 3-year-old daughter. Now, I know that when I was growing up and my age bracket were going into college, they had deferments. I don't think they're going to take an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old woman who's going to, I think they're going to have the same type of thing. What I'm saying is, don't you think that everyone is equal? I mean, I don't want anyone to go out and fight in a war. And I think that the Constitution will provide that there will be certain deferments, such as college, such as if you're in World War II, they're not going to take a young man with 2 children or whatever they have to support.
I have news for you. I'm sure you can't remember World War II.
No, I don't.
And they did take men with 2 children and 3 children and 4 children and 5 children.
But they wouldn't take the mother out of the home.
All the way up through age 35.
Right, but
and they put them in the bitterest type of combat.
I'm sure.
And if they could stand up and their hearts were beating and they were the right age, they took them.
Okay, but would they take women
yes,
of that same
because
age
the Constitution would require
with 2 children?
Absolutely.
See,
because what the Equal Rights Amendment would require...
deferments are still legal with the ERA.
But not under ERA. You could not have a deferment on account of sex. You could have a
But you could have a deferment on account of college, physical handicap, or a certain number of children, depending on what the manpower, or should I say person power, need would be.
Yes, but it would have to be the same for men and women. And I don't understand how a young woman who saw the men of her age group being drafted and called out to to serve in Vietnam, if she feels that is her moral obligation, I don't understand why she didn't feel morally obligated to serve too, if that is her point of view.
All right. Let me just show you the ERA, because there's so much been said about it. You are entitled to know what it is. In fact, if we were to speak about it, at least let's know what we're talking about. This is the amendment proposed, for which 3 states must ratify in order for it to become an amendment to the Constitution. Equality of rights under law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any states on account of sex.
Now, the trouble with that is...
That's all it says. Now, there's no more or less to that.
Oh, yeah, there is more to it. Oh, sure, there's more to it. But the trouble with that, because there's another section, but the trouble with that section is there are no exceptions. And it doesn't make any difference how many reasonable arguments you could bring to say this is a justifiable exception, or it doesn't make any difference whether the majority of the people might want an exception.
An exception, for example. That's not true, Mrs. Schlafly. There are exceptions.
There are no exceptions. You just read it.
It is possible for the United States Code of Military Draft, or whatever we call it, if there is to be a draft, let's pretend the worst, that there is to be a draft. It is quite possible for the United States Congress to enact legislation which would exempt certain people from the draft.
But they could not make the difference on the basis of sex.
Right.
And that is exactly the way they have made it through 9 wars and for 200 years. And that is what would be forbidden by...
All right, I'm a general. Why couldn't I say, okay, we're going into battle now. Let me find somebody here. We're going into battle now. We're going to take Hamburger Hill. But I'm sorry, but you can't go. You're too small, and...
I'm not even tall enough to be an airline stewardess.
Yeah. Do you understand what I'm saying? Is that
No. Do you know who was the most highly decorated hero of World War II? He was Audie Murphy, and he wasn't any bigger than this young woman here.
But he certainly was stronger.
That's because he's a man.
Right.
He was stronger because that's the difference between men and women.
In the case of Audie Murphy vis-a-vis this woman, yes, he was the stronger of the two.
Because he's a man.
But there are some men who aren't as strong as her.
Well,
and if they're drafted, they won't be asked to go up Hamburger Hill.
I have news for you. The people who get sent into combat are the people who don't have skills for other things.
But nobody is going to take a physically incapable person into a combat situation at the expense of other people.
Oh, sure they do. Sure they do.
All right, then why aren't we worried about them doing that to young men today?
Well, we are worried about it, but the trouble with ERA is it doesn't give you any chance to make any reasonable differences between men and women. And if there's anything that's absolutely sure, is that the military will obey the Constitution. For exactly the same reason that the military now would be incapable and forbidden to say we're going to take Hamburger Hill, but we're sending only blacks or only whites, because that is forbidden. And they would say, I don't care what you thought your reason was, you obviously discriminated. Yeah. And if they sent a group up to take Hamburger Hill and it's only men, General, you discriminated.
So your real concern is that we're going to drag these helpless women by the hair up Hamburger Hill and because we said, all right, chick, you asked for it, now let's go.
Well, that's what they did to men.
You really think they're going to do that?
Have you talked to any of the men who went to Vietnam? A couple of million of them. And they were dragged.
Okay.
Well, so the men didn't want to go, and they didn't want to be drafted either. And
but
just
they
because,
went.
Right. Well, just because we're women, why should we be exempt from that? And I think that using the draft as an excuse to ban the ERA amendment when we have so many rights that are being taken away from us and we have no recourse because we are women. And this is the only law that will give us legal grounds to take recourse against laws that are discriminating against us, laws that discriminate us against loans and against all other types of things and property. In some states, wives lose everything when they get married, and they have no recourse unless we pass a law.
Well, you have your choice now to sign up and to serve if you want to. But by ERA, you're taking away that right of choice from the other women. And that is the great legal right that ERA takes away from women. But you've got your choice to serve if you feel that's your duty. Now, in the matter of loans, I guess you haven't heard of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. It gives women everything they could possibly want in the field of credit. No woman can be discriminated against on the basis of credit at the present time. We have an overriding, all-inclusive federal law that takes care of that.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, I'm really unhappy and disappointed with your presentation on the Equal Rights Amendment, because that was just Section 1. And this is how I personally got really into this, because I found out there was a Section 2.
Tell me about it.
Section 2 gives the federal government the right to implement and to interpret what happens under ERA. And that federal government
Well,
is so
that's true. If that's true,
removed.
the United States Supreme Court has that right to interpret.
Right.
All right, but
And
that's true with
Congress-
every amendment or every sentence in the Constitution.
No, not specifically put in there.
What part of the Constitution is not subject to the review and interpretation of the United States Supreme Court?
Well, I think in this particular area, when it deals with our private lives and with sex discrimination, giving Congress the power to implement it is something that I agree with this young woman. We've had so many rights taken away, and if we have to go to the government to have them solve our problems and not be able to do it on the local level, so I think that should be made clear.
Can I just...
I'd like to answer that question, Phil. What the Section 2 of the Equal Rights Amendment does is to federalize any type of legislation that makes a difference between men and women. It moves it up to the federal level for enforcement. It enables Congress to pass laws about it and the bureaus to administer it. Now, you've got still a large area that's handled at the state level, and principal among that would be marriage and divorce. This is a matter that is exclusively handled at the state level. But what ERA does in giving to the federal government the power of enforcement would mean we would have a federal divorce law. Now, in Illinois last year, we spent about 3 months in our legislature rewriting our divorce law, and if we want changes in it, we can redo it next year. But I see nothing to be gained by giving this whole area of new power to the federal government.
So you wouldn't mind if we had this language in the Illinois state constitution?
I would mind this language, but what we have in the Illinois Constitution is the perfect language. We have the most progressive, up-to-date Constitution in the country, and it uses the language equal protection of the laws. Now, that might sound similar, but it isn't the same. It is the language of the 14th Amendment, and under that language, you are enabled and allowed to make reasonable differentiations of treatment when you've got good reasons for doing so.
But the reasonable differentiations of treatment would still be possible with the existence of the ERA.
No.
I could say as the general, I choose not to take Henrietta with me on this particular incursion into the jungle because Henrietta is slight of build, and I'm afraid that it's already been determined in boot camp that she's not capable of carrying for the miles that we're probably going to have to endure the kind of weight that we've got to have for this particular military exercise. And in that sense, I am discriminating against her, not because of her sex, but because of her potential as a human being and the energy that she has.
Well, the Pentagon has already asked for the repeal of the laws that keep women out of combat. They are already putting women in the Army through
Well, that doesn't
various
make it
types of
right. You know, the Pentagon also got us in Vietnam, or certainly didn't do anything to... I mean, because the Pentagon doesn't want it doesn't necessarily follow that it's
No,
right.
and I think we're going to beat that request because I don't think the American people want to put their women in combat. Women today have the wonderful option. They can join up and serve, or they don't have to. And if they do join up and serve, they have the best of both worlds.
Why wouldn't we also give that wonderful option to men?
Well, you get the men to stop wars, but ERA isn't going to stop wars.
All right. Suppose a woman wants to volunteer. Is that all right with you?
Oh, sure.
Suppose she wants to be, and presuming all other things, suppose she wants to engage in the Hamburger Hill exercise that we've been throwing around here. Is that okay with you?
Well, I'm not in favor of it, but let me say, if for those women who do favor that, you still have to beat ERA in order to get the choice. If you want to say we want to let women have the choice of going into combat or not, you have got to beat ERA in order to have that. Under ERA, you've got to treat men and women equally, and you know good and well men have no choice. When they're assigned into combat, they go, period.
Yes. All right.
ERA doesn't say you have to treat men and women like the same person. It just says you can't discriminate because I'm a woman. That doesn't mean that we have. It just that what you're saying doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean that they're going to draft women. It doesn't mean that they're going to have to draft women. If the Pentagon's going to do it anyway, then having ERA certainly isn't going to hurt it. I don't understand your whole thing. Divorce laws. Do you mean that the entire country is going to have a no-fault divorce law, or not going to have a no-fault divorce law? You're very vague.
Let her speak.
Okay, on the divorce law, what Section 2 does is to give the decision-making and the enforcement power to the federal government. Now, there are 7 other amendments to the Constitution which have that same language, and we've had a great deal of new interpretation by the Supreme Court in the last 10 years of that language, and we know exactly what it means. And it means that it is a big grant of power to the federal government. It means that the federal government can say, even though your state law is perfectly constitutional, we don't happen to like the way you did it, and we are substituting our judgment for yours. Now, that's what that language means. Well, it means that we can have our divorce law the way we like it now. But when HEW drafts a regulation, what chance do you have to get it the way you want it?
Who says we like it now?
Well, if you don't like it now, you can petition your state legislature, and you've got a lot of input and a lot more chance to get it the way that the people of our state want it. And it was just changed last year. And ERA does specifically mean that if we have another war with a draft, women would have to be drafted, because what ERA does is to change the law. And the law cannot say men do this, women do that. It would have to say persons and taxpayers and spouses do this.
But Phyllis, I should say, Mrs. Schlafly, pardon the familiarity. It really is not fair of you to suggest that the ERA totally makes the military decision makers helpless in determining who is best suited to take Hamburger Hill.
But
that's not fair.
They can't decide it on the basis of sex.
That's fine with me.
Well, it isn't fine with most of us.
Well, what troubles you? If a woman is capable of it, the horror is the same, regardless of the sex, in the wooden box on the airplane coming back from Vietnam. That's a horror story, and we all ought to be ashamed of ourselves for having not had the ability to avoid this kind of conflict. But granting that it happens, if a woman is capable of wearing the hand grenades on her belt, we'll put the bayonet in her teeth, and we'll send her up there to try and stamp out evil, however we define it, assuming we're all for this war. What's wrong with that?
Well, in the first place, the horror may be the same in the wooden box, but the horror isn't the same before you get there. And for the same reason that I will let my sons go alone at night in downtown Chicago and St. Louis, but I won't let my daughters do the same thing, I don't think we want our women in that situation. But in the second place, for those who have that point of view, I think we're entitled to discuss and debate that issue on its merits and let the people decide. And every time we've had a draft act, it's voted on by Congress, by our congressmen. Now, for those who think that the next draft act ought to say persons instead of males, you can go and testify, you can have the vote, and we can solve that question in the democratic process. What I object to is putting us in a noose that we have no choice. And the next time we have a Pearl Harbor or an emergency, we don't have any choice. We can't make a reasonable discrimination that this is an emergency that calls for drafting fathers but not mothers, etc.
Except for the Hamburger Hill thing. You know, service can be good for you. I mean, how many parents have sent this troubled child off to the Navy and he wound up being the vice president of J.C. Penney's? I mean, well, if it works for men in that kind of social sense, why couldn't it also work for women?
Well, you think of the Army in terms of a peacetime volunteer military, but just remember that overnight it can be converted into an involuntary wartime situation. And that, after all, is the purpose of the military. The purpose of the military is not to have a giant social welfare program and join the Navy and see the world. The purpose is to defend the United States. And when they make that commitment, they've got to be ready on call to defend us at the cost of their lives.
All right. We're with Phyllis Schlafly in Chicago, which is in Illinois, which happens to be your home state. You're a resident of Alton, Illinois. How do you feel about this? We hope you'll join. Phyllis Schlafly is against the ERA, but you already knew that, and we're trying to develop a dialogue here about this issue.
Yes. The week before last, it was almost impossible to listen to any program on the radio without hearing people talk about the effect of the boycott on business in Chicago and in Illinois, specifically because we have failed as a state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, I would like to know how boycotting business in Chicago can bring about the ratification of the ERA.
Am I to assume you don't think it can?
I don't think it should. To me, it looks like a form of blackmail.
But if you don't like this television show, you can boycott it by not watching.
Right.
So that's legal, though. That's the good old American way.
But, all right, I just turn it off and I don't,
Right.
all right. But if I am a hotel or a restaurant or a theater in Chicago and people turn me off, I go out of business, and so do all my employees.
But-
And I didn't do anything.
Yeah, but
I
that's-
didn't do anything.
Right, but
You
that's...
do something I don't like.
I
That's
understand
different.
that. Okay, if we can chat just for a moment. When proprietors a long time ago refused to serve blacks at lunch counters, those businesses were picketed.
Yes.
And people, it was the hope, would not then trade with that company. And in some cases, just let me, it was effective. Now, the little high school girl who worked as the soda jerk at this place lost her income because people didn't come in. Aren't you saying the same thing? You know,
I don't think you can equate the two things. In the first place, when there was discrimination on the basis of color, there was really something that was very wrong. I can't see anything wrong with people exercising their choice to ratify or not to ratify. What's wrong about that?
Well, there's another difference, Phil, I'd like to comment on. If the hotel refused to serve blacks, it was the hotel that was doing the wrong thing. But in this case, the wrong thing, according to the ERAers, is not being done by the Hilton and the Sheraton and the Marriotts and the restaurants and so forth. It is the legislature, and this is a secondary boycott. It is causing financial losses and loss of jobs to innocent parties who had nothing whatever to do with the controversy, and that is what is so wrong. I think this just shows.
but it wasn't the girl at the soda fountain.
No, but
who
it was the
doing wrong
management
thing.
of the soda fountain that was committing the wrong.
Well, the feminists would argue that it's the management of the state through their elected representatives
But
who
they're
are
not the
failing
ones
to
they're boycotting. The people they're hurting are the hotels, the restaurants, the taxi cabs, and the retail stores. And they have absolutely no power to do anything about it. And that's why it's so wrong. And personally, I feel, in checking with our people around the country, that this boycott is only stiffening the backs of people who do not want to ratify ERA. They just see that what kind of people are pushing ERA, and it isn't getting them anywhere.
Yeah. My sense is that you do not support the ERA, or perhaps that's not fair of me to conclude that from your question.
I don't support it. How could I?
Well, tell me how you couldn't.
Well, because it doesn't do anything for me. It takes away from me rights that I have had equal rights all of my life. I don't need an amendment to the Constitution to give them to me. You tell me something that the Equal Rights Amendment will give me that I do not already have, or that I can't get under the law if I want it, if I need it. Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the hopes of the people who support ERA is that this basic, fundamental right that should be inherent just by virtue of our being born should be built into the Constitution, namely the insurance that we will not discriminate against a person simply because of sex. I guess with your question, what rights have I lost, I would ask, what can be so bad about an amendment which attempts to ensure that you will not be treated differently because you will not be treated in a way that will deprive you of opportunities because you're a woman?
Well, why do I have to go out and get that protection in advance? No one has ever taken anything away from me that I felt I was entitled to.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't that easy.
Right. You've always felt that you received equal pay for the work that you've done?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But may I say,
Well, it's pretty hard to argue with that if you feel it. Let you say what?
but let me say that I prepared myself to do a job, and I did it.
Mm-hmm.
And I could still do it.
Yes.
Yes. First of all, I just want you to know that I took a weightlifting class in college in 1970, and I was not discriminated against because I was a woman, and I was the only girl in that class. I think a lot of the discrimination that we're talking about is past discrimination. And the question that I have for Mrs. Schlafly is concerning the International Women's Year Conference. I understand that there is going to be appropriated some more money for this, and I'm wondering if you could kind of go into that a little bit more and explain to us what effect this is having on the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment.
The Commission on International Women's Year, at its very first meeting, adopted a resolution pledging to do all in its capacity to see that ERA is ratified at the earliest possible moment. Now, since that resolution, they have spent $5,750,000 of our taxpayers' money. And the ERA is their highest priority. And I think this is the big thing we're trying to fight. We work on our money, they work on our money. And their time has now run out since they had that big consciousness-raising session in Houston last November, and they have asked President Carter to give them more money. Now, I don't think Congress will vote them any more money, but they're trying to get the president to allocate it or take it away from other agencies, and I don't know, he might do it. They want to keep the thing going. Now, I feel that what happened in Houston last November really shows what the women's liberation movement is all about and how ERA is the centerpiece of all of their goals. And they put them all together in what they call their hot-button issues, which were ERA, a government-funded abortion given to teenagers even without parents' knowledge or consent, homosexual privileges to teach in the schools and have child custody, and massive universal child care as a government responsibility to the tune of $25 billion a year additional expense. Now, that is what they wanted, and that is what they are using our money to work for through the Commission on International Women's Year.
Okay, I must break here, but we'll be back in just a moment with Phyllis Schlafly. Yes. Phyllis Schlafly.
Mrs. Schlafly, I'd like to ask you a question, but first I want to state something first. I have 4 daughters who I don't want to see go to war, who would have to register at this next election, but or the time they would have to go. But when they were about 6 years ago in high school, and I saw them being brainwashed into accepting a philosophy that was completely anti-family and un-American, I didn't know where to turn. And you came on, and at that time the media was very pro-ERA and pro-women's liberation, and I thank you immensely for being articulate enough for those of us who are not quite so to take over. My question is, though, I don't want to get...
Let me ask you a question. What was anti-family?
Well, you would have to have a daughter in the particular schools that I have tried a couple, where even the books were geared towards a new revolution, a new making over of the family. Divorce laws were the divorce rate was zooming, and the girls were being taught not the traditional values that I was taught and that I wanted them to be brought up in.
But our generation holds the record for divorce. I mean, if it was so good for us, how come we haven't held it?
I think it's because, well, I don't want to get caught up in that because I don't think I want to get into that issue because it could be a long time. I think the women's movement has had a lot to do with that. But I wondered, Mrs. Schlafly, in talking about the rights of women, people don't see a connection. Some people don't. I do. I think it's the biggest enemy, the unborn child. Can you explain the connection between the abortion issue and the Equal Rights Amendment?
Well, first of all, the people pushing ERA and pushing abortion are about 98% the same people. We saw that certainly in Houston at the International Women's Year Commission, and you see that also in the major women's liberation movement organizations. Secondly, they're very nervous now that they see a public tide going against abortion, and what they want to do is put abortion into the Constitution. I think that there are at least 2 legal theories that they would use to establish abortion as a right under ERA. One is that anti-abortion laws only affect women. Therefore, they're sexist. Therefore, they would be unconstitutional under ERA. The second is that women need to achieve their full equality in our society, and in order that they can go into any career and not be handicapped differently from men, they have to have their equal right not to be pregnant. Therefore, they have to have the right to abortion. And so I feel that they would use those theories to establish abortion as a constitutional right under ERA.
Would you like a constitutional prohibition on abortion?
Yes.
Why would you want the federal government to intervene into the private lives of people from that level when you're so against it on issues?
I don't want the federal government to do it.
Well, then you just said you did.
No, the anti-abortion laws...
Did you not just say that you wanted a federal anti-abortion law?
Well, under our system of government, when the Supreme Court makes a mistake, that's the only recourse you have is through a constitutional amendment. But the anti-abortion laws all should be, and always were, for 100 years in our society, state laws, and I think that's the way it should be.
So you want it to be a state law, not a federal law?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm a little confused. You said you
They
wanted...
were state laws. They were all state laws. What the Supreme Court knocked out in the Roe versus Wade case were state laws.
All right, so if we allow...
And the only way, it's when the Supreme Court injects itself and gives us a new law, in effect, the only way you have to remedy that is through a constitutional amendment.
All right. Well, okay, not to be argumentative, but just to understand your position. You feel that if a woman becomes pregnant, she has an obligation, a moral obligation, I presume, to continue that pregnancy and should not be legally permitted to terminate it.
I do not think a woman should have the right to kill her unborn baby.
So she should... So...
I just don't go for all these euphemisms. It's not terminating a thing, it's killing an unborn baby.
And, all right, and you want laws to ensure that she is not permitted to do
For
that?
for the same reason that we
Okay.
don't allow an adult to kill its unwanted, undesirable, useless old parent.
And you also, I think, do not want laws which you think that parents should be notified if a child is pregnant, for example, if a teenager is pregnant. In other words, the teenager who becomes pregnant in high school should not be able to unilaterally get an abortion. She should be obliged to counsel with her parents on this issue.
Well, you can't get her ears pierced without getting the parents' consent.
You can get your ears pierced. That's not true. You can get your ears pierced without your parents' consent. Yeah. At what age in your view, would a young woman be able to make that decision on her own without consulting her parents? 18?
I guess 18.
And you're also against, I think, daycare centers. It's not so much the daycare centers as it is the federal funding that you're against. Is that right?
Well, I think you have to understand what the women's liberation movement, when they urge daycare centers, this is not a need program to help poor and needy people. We already have that to the tune of about $1 billion a year. The proposals that they pushed at Houston, and which are constantly pushed through the women's lib movement organizations, would cost, estimated by Time magazine, $25 billion a year. Now, the code words are universally available for all socioeconomic classes. Now, this is to be a matter of right. You make the child the responsibility of the government because the women's liberation movement thinks it's so unfair that society expects mothers to look after their babies. Now, I think babies should have the best care, and the best care is mother care. It's not institutional care.
What if mother has to work because she married a lush who couldn't hold a job?
Well, there are a lot of people in that, and there are all kinds of ways, and as a matter of fact, the big majority of children in that condition right today are being cared for within the family unit. And it's a much preferable way. You have a father working a different shift, a grandmother, a grandfather, an aunt, an older brother or sister. And family care is much preferable. And mothers don't want institutional care. And what is so wrong is not only the cost, not only the bureaucracy that it would require, but the establishment of the principle that child care is the government's job and not the mother and father's job.
We're with Phyllis Schlafly in Chicago again.
The debate on the Equal Rights Amendment has been going on now for over 6 years. It hasn't been ratified.
Yeah.
I think that proves that the majority of women do not want it. Now they're asking for an extension of time. How long can this go on? Until they finally push it through one way or another?
Well, that's what they're hoping. But I think that this demand to extend the time is just like a losing football team that demands that a fifth quarter be played to give them time to catch up. It is definitely changing the rules in the middle of the game. When ERA came out of Congress, it specifically said in the resolution, resolved that this goes into the Constitution if ratified by 3/4 of the states within 7 years from date of passage. And that time runs out on March 22nd, 1979.
Yes.
Now, to change it now, after our legislature has debated and discussed and voted on it 6 times, and the 7th one coming up, I think is highly unreasonable.
Yes.
Hello. I'd like to ask you a question, Phyllis. I attended International Women's Year Conference in Normal and was very disappointed there to see that the legitimate issues of women's rights were not considered, and I certainly hope that there is not another International Women's Year at taxpayers' expense. Now, my question deals with what will ERA do in the area of education and sports? I'm very much a sports enthusiast myself.
Well, the education amendments of 1972 give women the opportunity to go into any professional school, any career that they want, have any type of educational training. But there are certain exceptions in the law. There are exceptions for single-sex schools and colleges. You've got a certain number of people who like to go to an all-girls school or college. Use Smith and Bryn Mawr and Wellesley and so forth. It has an exception for seminaries. It has an exception for military academies, for fraternities, sororities, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, YMCA, YWCA, mother-daughter, father-son events. Now, these are all, and also the contact sports, football, boxing, wrestling, ice hockey, and rugby. Now, the ERA, if it goes into the Constitution, would be the supreme law of the land, and it would wipe out anything that is contrary to it in any law. So it would wipe out all these exceptions, and it would mandate a total sex-neutral or gender-free approach in everything to do with the schools. And you would deprive people of that diversity in our educational system, of that opportunity to engage in those single-sex functions if they want to.
Yes.
My question has to deal with the daycare center. This is a follow-up to what you were saying before. If the government does provide funds for daycare centers, therefore it allows people who it is necessary for them to go to work. They do not have another way of taking care of their children. This does give them the option of a place to provide for their children, which would be responsible care.
Well, I said we are spending about $1 billion a year on that for the truly needy. Also, in the current tax law, there is a very generous tax credit allowance for women who find it necessary to take a job and to put their children in some type of daycare facilities. It's quite generous. And I don't see that we should do any more than that to induce middle-class women to go out and take a job and assign the care of their children to somebody else.
Well, basically, I think it's very nice for the women to have the option.
Well, it's a matter of who's going to pay for it. It's nice to have options, sure, but it's a matter of who is going to pay for it.
I guess I just feel that people should be given more of a choice where that's concerned.
Well, you have to get out and earn the money in order to have all kinds of choices in this world. And I think that the conditions in the present tax law are adequate for that. And if you've got all kinds of facilities to take care of the truly needy. I don't think we should, as a social purpose, induce women to make it financially advantageous to park their children with somebody else at our expense and then go take a job.
How do you feel about the suggestion that every day millions of men park their children with women at the women's expense?
Well, I hope those men are bringing home their paycheck to pay for the groceries. That's a very helpful function.
That's the whole point.
And also, if they'd like to spend their time with their children, they could take some hours away from watching the boob tube in order to play with their children.
But Mrs. Schlafly, you'll have to acknowledge that for many, many American families, this single income is no longer enough. That inflation, which has taken hold of all of us, and the point should also be made that inflation is really a situation that we find in an economy which is pretty much male-controlled, so that people are not making it anymore to the next paycheck.
Yeah, but the big cause of inflation is the federal bureaucracy and the federal spending, and you're not going to solve that by creating nurseries for children all over the country.
And they would argue that maybe if we made it just a little bit easier for women to have more choices, for example, to not only to succeed without typing, maybe to succeed in a business that challenged their own talents and paid them commensurate with their talents, we wouldn't have the need for this.
Why, they've got
expense.
EEOC right today enforcing affirmative action quotas on businesses all over the place. It's much easier for a woman to get a job than a man.
Separate from the ERA for a moment, just forget about the ERA for a moment. Don't you agree that we live in a sexist society that gives men more opportunities than women?
No, I think the women have many more opportunities.
You do?
Why, sure.
Then why
the
don't
woman
we have
has
more
got,
women conductors?
The
Why
wo-
don't we have
because-
symphony orchestras?
Well, because the women have the great career opportunity to devote a part of their lives to home and family and have the great fulfillment of having children, and another part of their life to something that they want to do in an intellectual, cultural, or business way.
And we'll be... That's Phyllis Schlafly, yes.
I would just like to express my own opinion. I, for one, don't want to go in the service. I don't want my daughter to go in the service. And I don't want to have to work if I don't have to. I love being a wife and a mother, and I love my husband to open the doors in front of me. I'm not for this.
Yes, please be brief.
I agree with you. I'm a mother and I love it. But why does everybody think that ERA is going to not make you a mother anymore and think you're going to have to go work when you don't want to? I think that's wrong.
Because what the Equal Rights Amendment does is to make all of our laws sex neutral. And therefore you could not any longer have a law that says the husband must support his wife. That is a sexist law. And there are 40 million wonderful husbands today who are supporting their wives. What I think is so wrong is to come along and say the Constitution now says this is the age of equality. That's no longer your responsibility.
I didn't know that there was a law that said my husband had to support me.
Yes, it's his obligation.
I just have a statement. Everyone write their congressman. They answer your letters.
That's true.
Good idea.
All right. Yes, ma'am. You want-
Also write your state legislators.
Yes.
Phil, I would just like to comment that I think Phyllis Schlafly is the perfect example of a woman who has pursued what she's wanted to do without the benefits of ERA. And I'm not really sure I want ERA because there are too many uncertainties. There are too many unknowns.
And the Supreme Court will resolve them all, and we just might not like the way they resolve them.
You don't want to? You want to? All right. Yes, ma'am. You understand?
What's pretty thrilling is that a couple of us in this audience have been fighting this thing for a long time, along with Phyllis, but the majority of the ladies here are here for the first time, and we notice that the groundswell is at last against this.
Right. I also don't hear, who here supports the ERA? Who here does not support the ERA? What do you think?
I support the ERA. I think that it has done a great deal for the American woman already. And in that the movement itself, Phyllis has stated many times that this law was passed in 1972, that law was passed in 1972. We have this already. EAR is not going to do anything for us. The movement itself has caused the legislators to pass these laws, and consequently, we have a lot of rights now that we did not have because of the movement.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it passes or goes through or not, it still has done a lot for the American woman already.
Yeah, but how do you explain the really overwhelming hostility toward it?
Well, I think that if you're not ever out in the job market, if you're not out competing with the men, I think sometimes it's very difficult to see that there is a discrimination against women.
Mm-hmm. You have been.
Yes, I have.
In other words, you felt you weren't paid. Were other men who were making?
I don't think necessarily it's the pay. I think that you are discriminated because you are a woman. Period.
Yeah.
In many jobs that you are, even if you are paid the same. I'm not talking about pay. And many, of course, we all know that women are paid less in a lot of jobs.
Yes. I don't know if you agree, though. I don't think you do.
No, I don't agree. Of course, no law is perfectly obeyed. You're always going to find some women who are discriminated against. But I think today, for every one of those, you can find a woman who's gotten her job on affirmative action simply because she is a woman.
So little time.
I'm personally against it because there is enough government intervention as it is now,
Well,
and we
that's a
don't
good
need any more.
Phyllis Schlafly is here. We're talking about the ERA, yes?
Well, I just want to know, are you against equal rights for women or just the ERA?
I'm against the ERA because I think it puts us in a straitjacket and doesn't allow us to make any reasonable exceptions or differences that reasonable people want.
But you think women should have equal rights?
In the overall picture, I think we should balance off the rights and responsibilities in total on men and women. But ERA requires us to make every law and every regulation the same, and I think the women are going to come out on the short end of that.
How come prohibition of discrimination against people because of race did not allow us to make reasonable decisions? You know, we don't have to hire a minority that, you know...
because we don't make... There aren't any reasonable discriminations that we allow on race.
Yes, there are.
No.
Sure.
The only one that I know of is when they gather the census data, they're allowed to say how many blacks and Mexicans and whites we have. And under ERA, the only difference they'd be allowed on sex would be to report how many women and how many men. But you couldn't make all these other reasonable differences that people want.
Phyllis Schlafly can be reached at Alton, Illinois. If you just want to write her, Phyllis Schlafly, Alton, Illinois, I'm sure it'll get to her.
If you can't spell that, write it to stop ERA.
Okay, Alton, Illinois. Thank you very much for being with us to discuss an important issue before us all, and thank you for your contribution. I hope you have a nice day. Bye.